A number of groups have raised the alarm that the response to the COVID-19 pandemic is being used as a cover for a substantial rise in authoritarianism around the world. Are they right? How worried should we be about it? Let's have a look. My name's Mallen Baker. This is the Mallen Baker Show for changemakers. For some people, the height of authoritarianism in the current age is telling people they have to wear a mask. And I mean, look, I get it. I really do. But requiring people to do something that neither harms nor particularly inconveniences them on the basis that it might actually have some benefit, well, if that's a big issue for us, it means we're doing pretty well. Because as we know, across the world, there have been many more serious things happening than that. I would say that the issue of face masks is the equivalent of whether plastic straws should be banned on the environmental debate. It's an issue that achieves symbolic importance well beyond its significance because it's something very familiar, very visible, very close to us in daily life. But authoritarianism takes a number of rather important forms, so let's focus on where this gets really sticky. Now, we do understand why we're in this situation. The argument is that in a time of genuine crisis, you have to do things that you wouldn't normally choose to do. And, that's pretty unarguable. Clearly, there are times when a public emergency threatens, where certain measures need to be taken that will and should interfere with our expectation of what we can do in our lives. The question is, as always, where do you draw the line? Because we don't think that just because there's the spectre of a crisis that the state should be able to throw out all of the babies with all of the bathwater. In other words, extinguishing all human rights and other freedoms. If we did, wouldn't be much of a surprise that would-be dictators would simply invoke the crisis clause at the earliest possible opportunity, which is exactly what they have done throughout history. And not just dictators. The historian Robert Higgs once observed that during the 20th century, various wars and other emergencies, including viruses, regularly led to permanent expansions of state power. Emergency measures would ratchet up the mechanisms of control. After the crisis had passed, the measures would be relaxed, but not all the way back to where they had been before. There'd still be some additional powers that governments retained that they didn't have before the crisis came along. And I'm not even suggesting that something like that is necessarily always a bad thing. I don't have a specific example in mind, but you could imagine there might be an unpalatable but necessary reform that becomes possible only when the crisis highlights its necessity. But you want to be very aware of the process. And it should be properly scrutinised, not just allowed to happen by default, and particularly where it involves an erosion of rights. According to the Syracusa Principles endorsed by the UN Commission on Human Rights in 1984, some rights remain non-derogable. They can't be breached under any circumstances. And there are principles that should apply to the other occasions. Specifically, the severity, duration and geographic scope of any emergency measure that derogates from civil and political rights must be strictly necessary to the relevant public threat and proportionate to the problem you're trying to solve. Emergency and consequent derogations that are not made in good faith are therefore violations of international law, which is easy to say. The European Assembly made a good statement about this in 2018, having noted that at a time of public emergency, such situations may even require restrictive measures that exceed what is normally permitted under the European Convention of Human Rights. And he went on to say this: fundamental safeguards of the rule of law, in particular legality, effective parliamentary oversight, independent judicial control and effective domestic remedies must be maintained even during a state of emergency. Due democratic process, including separation of powers, as well as political pluralism and the independence of civil society and the media, must also continue to be respected and protected. You can reduce it down to 4 key points: the rule of law, oversight by the elected body, democratic process, and free speech and sharing of information. So yeah, take the measures that you need to take, but make sure that the crisis is not being used as an excuse to erode fundamental foundations of a free and democratic society, because so long as those elements are still in place, Ultimately, there'll still be some momentum for course correction as things go forward and if they start to go wrong. And you can see that in a number of countries, indeed including the UK. There is currently a vigorous debate on whether lockdowns work, what the right balance of policy should be, what advice is being given by the advisors, and whether the government should be following that advice. That debate is not perfect, but it does mean there is some reflection and some accountability. History has shown us the alternative, the use of emergency powers to consolidate presidential authority in the Weimar Republic, committing human rights abuses in India under Indira Gandhi, and numerous others. The big difference between the COVID-19 pandemic and those previous examples is that those were all national or regional events. What we have with this pandemic is a global event, exacerbated by the ease of travel around the world, which is part of the modern era. And the very first example of action we saw was the authoritarian Chinese state, carrying out a complete lockdown, a measure that most thought at the beginning would never be acceptable in most other societies. But then the first democratic states showed that you could indeed emulate those measures, and so the imposition of curfews, national lockdowns, travel bans and citizen surveillance simply swept across the globe in an unstoppable wave. Everywhere, the implications are now beginning to look concerning. Some governments, as you would expect, have seized the opportunity more than others. So, what has been happening? Well, let's start with free speech. We may be, and in my view we should be, concerned with how non-orthodox voices have been censored on platforms like YouTube and Facebook. But in some parts of the world the level of censorship is much more severe. So for instance, in Egypt, President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi has used the COVID-19 crisis to amend emergency powers, with a specific focus on eroding rights to protest and freedom of speech. We saw Lina Atala, the editor of Madamazu, arrested while interviewing the mother of a prisoner on hunger strike. Egypt also expelled and threatened international journalists who had questioned somewhat unlikely official figures. In Madagascar, journalists have been arrested for criticising the government's response to COVID-19. And bear in mind, the government's response reportedly includes the promotion of a herbal cure for the virus. In other words, government-sanctioned quack medicine. When President Trump promoted hydroxychloroquine, the media were free to pour scorn or to find supporting voices as they wished. Not so in Madagascar. In Thailand, in Cambodia, Venezuela, Bangladesh and Turkey, governments have been using the virus as an excuse to detain journalists, political opposition and even healthcare workers if they dare to criticise government action or indeed inaction. Some of the other governments are taking the opportunity to introduce higher levels of digital surveillance of citizens. This is something that's been much debated in the West, since governments such as those of France and the UK wanted their track and trace apps that would hold information on citizens centrally, but then the tech platform providers like Apple and Google basically refused to let them run the technology that would have enabled those apps. The highest profile example of successful surveillance has of course been China again, which already had a pretty well advanced surveillance state. China used its version of an app to be able to track where citizens went and what their virus status was. South Korea has broadcast detailed information about people's movements to anyone that might have had contact with them. They set up a website showing the behaviour of infected people prior to their diagnosis. This information was compiled from GPS phone tracking, credit card records and video surveillance. The National Human Rights Commission of Korea expressed alarm, unsurprisingly, about infected people being disgraced and ridiculed on the internet, leading to a survey that showed that people had become more worried about being accused of being infected than they were about actually catching the virus. Israel's government authorised its internal security agency to use location tracking data from the phones of Israeli citizens, and in Moscow, action comes in the form of the world's largest network of surveillance camera systems, equipped with advanced facial recognition technology. Now, do all those measures get put back in the box once COVID-19 is no longer an issue anymore? Let me think. It used to be that we assumed the world was going to catch democracy, that year on year more and more countries would embrace democratic and free principles. It was just a matter of time before the whole world caught up, and that would then truly be the end of history. Right now, countries seem more attracted to the techniques and the technology of the practiced surveillance state countries. So China's controversial tech company Huawei is pitching thermal imaging software to the Indian government, offering to help them apply the learnings from China to the situation in India. Huawei thinks this would be a great business because the system would use their 5G network, the one that many countries won't let them anywhere near because of security concerns. In Ecuador, a Huawei-built public security platform called ECU 911 gives police services access to GPS data from nearly 6,000 surveillance cameras across the country. In Slovenia, police were due to gain the power to track the phones of citizens without a court warrant. They were only stopped from doing that because the measure was held to fall foul of protections provided by the Slovenian constitution. The thing we've unhappily learned in this recent period is that it isn't simply a case of bad governments grabbing an opportunity to do this to an unwilling population against their wishes. There have also been instances where populations have welcomed, sometimes even demanded, excessive and authoritarian measures. In a number of societies, and the UK is one of these, let's be clear, there has been widespread shaming of people that have been held to be violating the rules, even when the rules involved were guidelines, not actual laws. Polls have shown that 65% of British adults would support government surveillance of mobile phone roaming data to track COVID-19 infected patients and their close contacts. And with nearly 50% agreeing that it should also be done to check whether people are following social distancing and lockdown rules, so they can be punished for not doing so. It's an important reminder that if it comes to a fight between freedom and safety, you shouldn't assume that people will choose freedom. Something to bear in mind if you'd embraced the comforting fiction that modern societies are in somehow different and inherently better to the German population with its acquiescence in the rise of Nazism in the last century. Not that much has changed. On the more authoritarian end of the spectrum, governments have been able to push even further, jettisoning any ability of democratically elected parliament to provide oversight. In April, Cambodia passed a state of emergency law allowing the government to carry out a wide range of actions with an arsenal of new criminal offences that could put people in prison for up to 10 years. This state of emergency was not time limited, and it can be invoked whenever the government thinks it's necessary to defend national security, public order, health, property and the environment. Those sound like the day-to-day concerns of everyday government to me. What do you think? India brought in a state of disaster for 21 days under the 2005 Disaster Management Act. This allowed the Prime Minister to effectively rule by decree without oversight. Something similar happened in Hungary, which allowed Prime Minister Viktor Orban to do the same. This included an offence of spreading false or distorted claims about the COVID-19 pandemic with a penalty of up to 5 years in prison. And very quickly, political opponents found themselves being arrested for alleged scaremongering. The state of emergency was lifted in the middle of June, but measures were put in place to make it possible to declare similar states of emergency in the future with rule-by-decree provisions that would be renewable indefinitely. In the Philippines, President Duterte has been granted emergency powers that amount to autocracy, as he can bypass parliamentary approval and can intervene in private businesses. Those measures are currently due to expire in December. One of the most obvious areas to the ordinary citizen is that of restriction of movement. In the UK, for instance, in the initial lockdown, the population were told they couldn't leave home unless they had a reasonable excuse. Those excuses defined down to the detail of how many times you could leave the house on your own to take exercise, even though being outdoors on your own involves no risk to anybody. So, according to the Syracusa Principles, you'd have a question mark there about how proportionate even those measures were. Police were given discretion on what would be considered to be necessary and proportionate, which some police interpreted in a highly restrictive manner. In one publicised case, warning a family for being in the front garden of their own property, for instance. France has been the example of the most authoritarian of the Western lockdown states, with a general prohibition of people being outside their homes, along with a requirement to carry a written statement of why they were outside that could be demanded by any police officer on pain of a significant fine or 6 months imprisonment. Another key issue of note is that of corruption. Authoritarian measures are often the vehicle by which governments and their friends enrich themselves at the expense of the public good. And a crisis that requires lots of money being earmarked for medical equipment and for hardship relief, it's an obvious opportunity for the corrupt. So you see measures like that in Serbia, where the president moved to buying equipment with no written procurement, saying as he did so, "You can prosecute me one day for providing respirators to the people." Which, seems fair enough. So how many respirators has the country bought and deployed? Well, according to Serbia's Prime Minister, the number of respirators in the country is a state secret. Got it. What could possibly go wrong? Now look, we could go on, simply listing and detailing the various things that have been done in countries across the world, because there are a lot more. But the point really is that these things aren't happening in isolation, and they're not separated from a trend. As the coronavirus pandemic spread across the world, so too has a parallel epidemic of authoritarian and repressive reactions, jumping from one country to another as they saw what others were getting away with and realised that they could do the same. Now, there's nothing complicated about this. There's no global conspiracy. There doesn't have to be. It's just opportunism, taking advantage of a global panic and seeing how it can be put to local use. The thing that should really focus your attention through all of this is that the recent period has just exacerbated a pre-existing trend. For more than a decade, freedom and democracy have been in something of a decline worldwide. More countries have lost than gained political rights and freedoms in each of the last 14 years, with a rate of decline accelerating rather than declining. This map by Freedom House makes it particularly stark. 80 countries that are seeing some reduction, and just the one that has grown stronger. That theory that the world was just going to get more and more democratic doesn't seem to be the case right now. So the bigger question isn't the one of the pandemic has allowed some bad things to happen. Really, it's that if we choose to notice, it has just made it much more obvious that we are on a new direction of travel and have been for some time. The populists who said, let's take back control, which you could say accounted for Brexit and Trump, those had a moment of ascendancy in recent years, but now the other extremes are saying, look at these looming disasters, we need to keep you safe, and that has an even more powerful popular appeal. The democratic populists tend to be the ones that have been held to have done badly in the pandemic, because their whole focus on individual responsibility, turning away from global corporatism, was almost calculated to be the mindset that would do least well in a situation where everyone decided they'd rather have safety than freedom. The genuinely authoritarian populists, the Orbans and the Dutertes, they have been much quicker to seize the opportunity presented to advance their own interests. They've talked up the crisis, not talked it down. Now, those people could be the alarming extremes. They could come to be seen as the trailblazers. Almost certainly the pandemic will pass within the next 12 months, hopefully sooner. In many countries, a lot of the emergency powers will disappear, although we know there'll be likely to be some ratchet effect. Some will remain. But the question that persists is whether we stay on this track, this trend line of deteriorating rights and freedoms worldwide. Or can we hold on to the core, due process, democratic oversight of executive, freedom of speech and political organisation, all those things? Because in the last few months we've had a glimpse of how fragile these institutional principles that we thought to be unshakable have actually proven to be. Unless you commit to them actively, robustly, they will wither away. We've taken an awful lot for granted. And if nothing else, at least the pandemic has provided the wake-up call of what we might lose if we're not careful.